A quiet town in England was rocked by fear, a killer with a chilling plan, and Poirot was their only hope. The small, misty town of Arkham-on-Sea sat in eerie silence, veiled by the thick fog that rolled in from the sea. Its streets, normally bustling with quiet, everyday life, were now a maze of shadows. The air felt colder than usual, as if the very town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dark to emerge from the depths. It had been years since anything truly unsettling had happened here, but tonight, something had shifted. Inside a quaint, unassuming shop on the edge of town, the body of Alice Asher was discovered. The scene was chilling. Alice, a well-known figure in the town, was sprawled on the floor behind her counter, her lifeless form frozen in a grim stillness. Her eyes were wide open, an expression of sheer terror painted across her face. A pale hand clutched a folded piece of paper, tightly gripping it as though it were her last desperate connection to someone. The note, now damp with the early morning dew, was unlike anything the officers had seen before. In bold, precise handwriting, the message simply read, A.B.C. The police were stumped. No signs of struggle, no apparent motive, just a dead woman, a cryptic note, and a town that could barely comprehend the horror that had befallen them. Inspector Japp of the local force scratched his head, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration as he ordered the scene sealed off. But as he and his team searched the shop for clues, there was no trail to follow, no fingerprints, no strange footprints, not even a hint of who could have committed such an act. As the town whispered nervously about the death, none could have predicted the next turn of events. Hours later, at his office in London, Hercule Poirot sat in his chair, staring at the freshly arrived letter that had just been delivered to him. His sharp eyes skimmed the paper, then narrowed with intense focus. The letter, written in the same flawless script, bore no return address, but the words it contained chilled him to his core. This is just the beginning, my dear Poirot. I have planned it every name, every letter, in perfect order. The town of Arkham-on-Sea is the stage, and this, the first scene. It will be an A, then a B, and then the next. Wait and watch, for the game has already begun. The letter ended with a final, unsettling line. A.B.C. will haunt them all. Poirot leaned back in his chair, the weight of the message sinking in. His mind, ever sharp, began to churn, analyzing every detail with perfect precision. He had faced murder before, but something about this felt different, personal, sinister. The killer's arrogance was palpable, and yet there was a sense of calculation beneath the madness. This was no ordinary case. The initial puzzle, the cryptic letters, the lack of any clear suspects was only the surface. Poirot could feel the shadows moving, slipping through the cracks of this seemingly peaceful town. This was not a simple murder, this was a plan, and it had only just begun. The town's tranquility would soon be shattered, and the alphabet would become the killer's twisted map. Poirot's lips tightened into a grim smile, and as he folded the letter, his voice broke the silence. This will be a case like no other. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promise. What lay ahead was far darker than anyone could imagine, and Poirot was already racing against time to stop it. Cliffhanger. What twisted game had the killer set in motion, and what chilling revelations would each letter bring? The investigation begins. The train chugged into Arkham-on-Sea with a hiss of steam, shrouded in the thick fog that seemed to grip the town in a vice. Hercule Poirot stepped off with his customary precision, his black hat perched perfectly atop his head, his sharp eyes scanning the fog-covered landscape. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a quiet, peaceful English town, the kind where nothing ever changed. But Poirot knew better. He felt the weight of the case pressing on him the moment he stepped off the train. The air was thick, but it wasn't just the fog that hung heavy in the atmosphere. It was the presence of something far darker, something unseen but very real. Poirot made his way towards the local police station, his footsteps steady, unwavering. Inside, Inspector Japp was already at work, his face a portrait of frustration. The case had stumped the entire force, and the arrival of Poirot only added to his growing irritation. Japp's dismissive glance said it all, but Poirot remained calm, his mind already turning over the small details. "You've come to gloat, Poirot," Japp sneered, the skepticism in his voice clear. "I am here to assist, mon ami," Poirot replied smoothly, his accent as polished as ever. "I see in your eyes the uncertainty that this case has brought upon you. Tell me what has happened here. I am intrigued." Japp grumbled, but he led Poirot to the shop where Alice Asher's body had been discovered. The scene was still fresh in everyone's mind. Poirot walked through the small, cluttered shop, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease. His eyes narrowed as they landed on the faint imprint left by Alice's hand, still gripping the note. The initials A.B.C. stood out like a challenge, one that Poirot could not ignore. There was something deeply personal about the crime. He could feel it. This wasn't just about a murder. It was something more. He turned to Japp. "You see, Inspector, it is not just the victim who matters here. It is the way she died. The fear in her eyes, it is not accidental. No, there is something behind this. Something that connects her to the next in line." Japp's brow furrowed. "What are you on about, Poirot? A simple murder. A woman who got caught up in something she shouldn't have." But Poirot's mind was already working, unraveling the threads that tied Alice Asher's death to something far more sinister. As he scanned the scene, his mind reached into the past, pulling up every tiny detail that might lead him to an answer. The strange initial A.B.C. wasn't just a clue, it was a signature. A sign of something bigger, something calculated. Poirot looked at the note one more time before he spoke again. "It is clear to me now, mon ami. Alice Asher was not the first, and she will not be the last." Japp stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "What are you talking about?" "Here is no connection, Poirot." "Ah, but there is," Poirot said, turning to walk back out of the shop. "And I shall find it." As the days wore on, Poirot's investigation led him deeper into the mystery, and strange coincidences began to emerge. The victims were not just connected by their names, but by something darker, something hidden in their pasts. Alice Asher, Betty Barnard, both had something in common, something they had no idea they were tied to until the killings began. Each woman had been involved, directly or indirectly, in a scandalous event from the town's Historia scandal that no one spoke of, but one that had shaped the very fabric of this town. The letters, Poirot realized, were not random at all. They were part of a much larger design, a twisted pattern that had been set into motion long before Alice had died. Poirot's mind raced as he uncovered more. He connected Betty Barnard's troubled past to the mysterious letter B. And then C, the next name was already in his head. And yet, no matter how many steps ahead he seemed to be, the killer always stayed one step further. Whoever this murderer was, they were as meticulous as Poirot himself. The pattern, the sequence, they weren't just aiming for random victims. No, the killer had a message, a reason for each life claimed, and Poirot could feel that he was getting closer to understanding the twisted logic. But the deeper he dug, the more resistance he encountered from the local authorities. Japp, still unwilling to accept Poirot's involvement, dismissed his theories as eccentric, as he often did with outsiders. The inspector's dismissive attitude only fueled Poirot's determination. There was no time to waste, and no one, not even Japp, was going to stop him from solving this. "Poirot," Japp grumbled one afternoon as they stood outside the town's old church. "You've got your theories, but this isn't some game. People are dying, and you are too busy playing detective to even see it." Poirot paused, his back straight, his voice calm and unwavering. "Ah, Inspector, you are right about one thing. This is not a game, but it is a puzzle. And puzzles, as you know, require patience, observation, and a great deal of understanding." He locked eyes with Japp. "This is a matter of life and death, mon ami. I shall solve it. You shall see. Just as Poirot's investigation seemed to gain ground, a new twist struck an unexpected lead that sent him spiraling down a dangerous path. It became clear that this wasn't just a series of random killings. The killer had an agenda, a personal vendetta that was far deeper than Poirot had anticipated. And the next victim, well, the clock was ticking. Cliffhanger. As Poirot finally pieces together the chilling connection between the victims, a shocking discovery emerges: a victim who was supposed to be the next target has already disappeared. The killer's reach is wider than anyone realized, and Poirot is running out of time. The suspects. The fog had not lifted, nor had the mystery surrounding Arcamon-C. It was now clear to Hercule Poirot that the murders were not just connected by the victims' names, but by the chilling pattern that each crime scene revealed. His mind buzzed as he walked the streets of the town, piecing together the puzzle, one dark detail at a time. The deaths of Alice Asher and Betty Barnard were only the beginning of a much larger, more sinister plot. Poirot stood in front of the quiet, unassuming shop where Alice Asher had met her untimely death. As he examined the scene again, he realized that the way the victims had been killed held a hidden message, a coded language that the killer had left for him. Each detail, the positioning of the bodies, the placement of the note, the subtle signs that others had missed, was a key. This wasn't random. No, it was all part of a grander design, a methodical mind at work. He turned to Inspector Japp, who had reluctantly been following Poirot's investigation, trying to keep up with the detective's sharp deductions. "Look here, mon ami," Poirot said, his fingers gently tracing the edges of the note left behind by Alice. "Each crime scene gives us a clue that leads to the next. The order, the symbols, even the very way the body is found. It's a language that speaks of something greater, something deliberate." Japp, still grappling with Poirot's brilliance, frowned. "So, you are saying the killer is leaving a trail we can follow?" Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Exactly. But the question is not just who will be next, it is why they are being chosen in the first place." The first suspect Poirot focused on was Lisa Asher, Alice's only daughter. She was a woman in mourning, her grief palpable as she stood in the quiet of her mother's shop, her face hidden behind the veil of sorrow. Yet Poirot could not ignore the undercurrent of something darker in her. A whisper of something that didn't quite add up. She was a grieving daughter, yes, but was that all she was? Poirot observed her closely as she tried to carry on with the mundane details of her life, though her every movement seemed forced, as if she were acting in a play she never wanted to star in. The town's dark history had followed Lisa like a shadow, lingering just behind her every step. She was connected to the town's murky past, a past that Poirot was only beginning to unravel. "Lisa Asher, tell me," Poirot asked gently, his voice smooth, like a predator luring in its prey. "Have you ever heard of the events that took place here many years ago? The things that the townspeople try to forget? Or perhaps, are you trying to forget them yourself?" Lisa stiffened at his words, her eyes momentarily betraying the mask she wore. "I have nothing to say about that." Poirot could see at the faintest trace of fear that flickered in her eyes. There was a secret here, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. Her connection to the town's dark past was no coincidence. But did she know more than she was letting on? Or was she merely another pawn in the killer's grand game? Next, Poirot turned his attention to Tom Barnard, Betty's ex-boyfriend. A volatile man, known for his fiery temper and history of violent behavior, Tom seemed like an obvious suspect. He had a motive: anger, jealousy, perhaps revenge. Poirot met him at a local pub, where Tom was drowning his sorrows in alcohol, his rough hands trembling slightly as he clutched the glass. "I didn't kill Betty," Tom spat, his voice raw with emotion. "But I wish I could have. She was a liar, a cheat. You don't know what she did to me." Poirot didn't flinch. "Tell me, Tom, what happened between you and Betty? Why this anger, this hatred?" Tom's face twisted with rage, but as quickly as the fury flared, it died down, replaced with a quiet, almost sorrowful expression. "It's too late now," he muttered. "What's done is done. She's gone, and here is nothing left to say." But Poirot wasn't convinced. Tom's volatile emotions didn't seem to match the calculated nature of the murders. He was a man who acted on impulse, not a man who could mastermind such a meticulous plan. Poirot's third suspect was Samar, a local historian who had spent years studying the town's forgotten past. Samar seemed harmless enough, but his obsession with the town's murky history gave Poirot pause. He was well versed in its dark secrets, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that Samar knew more than he let on. When Poirot visited Samar's home, he found the man surrounded by books and old town records, his face lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp. "I study the past to understand the present," Samar explained, his voice soft and contemplative. "The past never really leaves us. It lingers, like the fog." "And what of these deaths?" Poirot asked, his eyes narrowing. "Does the past have a hand in them?" Samar's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked his reaction. "The past is full of ghosts, Poirot. It's not for me to say who they choose to haunt." Poirot's mind raced. Samar's knowledge of the town's history was far too convenient, and his evasiveness made Poirot wonder whether the historian was hiding something much darker. Just as Poirot began to draw connections between his three key suspects, something unexpected happened, something that threatened to throw his entire investigation off course. A piece of evidence was discovered that led Poirot to believe that the killer might be someone with connections to the town's criminal underworld. A taunting note, a cryptic clue, suggested that the killer was not a member of the town at all, but someone with a far more sinister background. Poirot stared at the evidence, his mind working furiously. Was the killer truly an outsider, or was this a clever red herring trap set to mislead him? Cliffhanger. As Poirot contemplates the cryptic message, a new development occurs. A letter arrives at Poirot's office with a single sentence written inside. "I have just begun." The letter D is next. The investigation deepens. Poirot sat in the dimly lit room of the small inn, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his mind. The deaths were no longer just tragic events, they were a calculated, deliberate act of revenge. The killer's obsession with the alphabet, each victim's name falling neatly into the pattern, now made a disturbing kind of sense. But Poirot knew that the pattern alone wasn't enough. He needed to understand why these people were chosen. The breakthrough came when Poirot discovered a long-buried secret from the town's pasta scandal, so dark, so hidden, that it had remained forgotten for years. His investigation led him to an old town record, yellowed with age, in the dusty corners of the town hall archives. There he uncovered the story of a forbidden love affair, a betrayal that had torn apart families and left a stain on the town's reputation. The scandal was connected to a series of powerful names, including the Asher family and Betty Barnard's ancestors. As Poirot pieced together the puzzle, he realized with a chill that the victims Alice, Betty, and the others yet to come had all unknowingly been involved in the scandal. They were linked to the very families whose secrets had been buried in the past. The killer had not just chosen their names, they had targeted them because they were the unwitting descendants of those who had betrayed or wronged the murderer's ancestors. Poirot leaned back in his chair, stunned. The letters, the sequence of murders, this was no random act of violence. This was a meticulously planned campaign of vengeance, generations in the making. The deeper Poirot delved into the investigation, the more perilous it became. The killer, it seemed, was not content with simply taking lives. No, this person was a master of manipulation, setting traps not just for the victims, but for Poirot himself. One evening, as Poirot followed a new lead into a quiet alley, the air grew thick with tension. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he pressed on, his mind focused on the next clue. Suddenly, the world seemed to tilt, and Poirot barely had time to react as the ground beneath him gave way. The alley he had been walking through was a carefully laid snare designed to lead him into a death trap. The ground crumbled away, revealing a pit lined with sharp metal spikes. He only just managed to grasp a nearby railing, pulling himself back to safety. Poirot's heart pounded as he staggered back, his composure rattled for the first time in years. The killer had made it personal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about proving something. The stakes had escalated, and Poirot knew that he was no longer just chasing a murderer. He was being hunted. But the real shock came when Poirot discovered a chilling detail about the killer's identity, one that turned his entire world upside down. As Poirot meticulously reviewed his notes, piecing together the timeline of the murders, a sudden, terrifying realization struck him. The killer wasn't just targeting innocent townspeople. He was targeting people connected to Poirot's own past. Poirot's normally unshakable demeanor faltered as memories from his past long buried, forgotten came rushing back. He remembered a case he had worked on years ago, a case that had haunted him, one in which he had been unable to bring justice. It had involved betrayal, deception, and a life that had been lost. Now the murderer was targeting people who had crossed paths with Poirot during that case, and Poirot realized, with a sinking feeling, that his connection to the killer ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. The killer knew his past, and now they were making him pay for it. Cliffhanger. Poirot, shaken by the revelation, rushes to the next crime scene, desperate to stop the killer before anyone else is hurt. But when he arrives, he finds a note addressed to him, scrawled in blood on the wall. "You are next, Poirot." The final act. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder that the murderer's plan was drawing closer to its horrifying conclusion. Poirot stood in the middle of his cluttered study, surrounded by scattered notes, maps, and evident fragments of a puzzle that, until now, had refused to fit together. His mind, sharp as ever, was beginning to piece the riddle together, but the deeper he dug, the more the situation twisted, becoming darker, more dangerous. A chilling realization struck him. The killer was more than just a shadowy figure lurking in the town. They were someone far more connected to the investigation, someone close to Poirot, someone within his inner circle. The pieces of the puzzle no longer pointed outward, they pointed inward. Poirot's thoughts were a storm, each possibility more disturbing than the last. Who among his colleagues, his trusted allies, could have hidden such a dangerous secret? Was it someone he had misjudged? Someone he had trusted too much? The deeper he looked into the eyes of those around him, the more he began to question every gesture, every word. The next letter was on its way. Poirot could feel it in the air, the unease in the townspeople's eyes, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The killer was biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment. And Poirot knew that time was running out. Poirot's mind flashed back to the clues that had seemed insignificant at first, the offhand comments, the chance encounters, the mysterious figures who had appeared at the crime scenes. He thought of the quiet but persistent Samar, the local historian whose obsession with the town's past had often seemed excessive, bordering on manic. But there was something more there, something Poirot had missed. Was it possible that Samar had been hiding his own dark connection to the murders? Poirot's attention shifted to Inspector Japp, who had been increasingly distant. The inspector had always been a steady hand in the investigation, but lately he had been on edge, his behavior growing erratic. Was Japp hiding something? Was he more involved than he appeared to be? Poirot had once considered him a friend, but now doubts began to creep in. Poirot's thoughts turned to Lisa, Alice Asher's daughter, a grieving, fragile woman, but there was something unsettling about the way she had reacted to the deaths. The fear in her eyes had been real, yes, but was it possible that her grief masked something much darker? The night before the next murder, Poirot could barely sleep, his mind whirling with all the questions and suspects. The next letter would arrive soon, could feel the weight of it hanging in the air. He knew the killer's obsession with the alphabet was nearing its cruel climax, and Poirot, for the first time, felt the gnawing weight of his own vulnerability. The killer was getting closer, not just to the town's innocent residents, but to Poirot himself. As the sun set, the urgency grew. Poirot's thoughts were clouded by the creeping sense of doom, but just when it seemed like everything was closing in, Poirot's phone rang. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. "You've been chasing shadows, Poirot. The game is about to end, and you are already too late." A cold shiver ran down Poirot's spine. He rushed to the scene of the latest murder, where time seemed to slow. The house stood dark and silent, the shadows creeping around its edges. Poirot moved swiftly, his heart hammering in his chest, every step filled with an increasing sense of dread. And there, in the center of the crime scene, a body lay sprawled on the floor, a woman, the latest victim, her name scrawled on a piece of paper beside her. The killer's pattern was now clear, and Poirot knew that the next victim would follow soon, someone whose name began with E. But as Poirot knelt to examine the scene, his gaze fell upon something far more disturbing, a small blood-stained note addressed to him personally. It read, "You've been playing my game all along, Poirot. But you are just a pawn, just like the rest of them. Tomorrow it's your turn." The words were a punch to the gut. Poirot's heart pounded as he realized that the killer had been one step ahead of him the entire time, playing a game with far more deadly consequences than he could have imagined. The clock was ticking, and this time, Poirot was the one in danger. Cliffhanger. As Poirot stares at the note in his trembling hands, a shadow flickers behind him. He spins around too late. The figure vanishes into the darkness, leaving Poirot with a chilling question. Who in his inner circle has been manipulating him all along? Chase. The final race against time. The air was thick with anticipation, and Poirot could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. The clock was no longer just ticking. It was a drumbeat, counting down to something far darker. The killer had not only been playing with the town, but with Poirot himself, orchestrating a series of murders that were leading toward an inevitable and deadly climax. The time for theorizing was over. The game had turned into a race, and Poirot was racing against a killer who knew the town's darkest secrets. Poirot stood at the heart of the town, his sharp eyes scanning the familiar streets, now tainted with a sense of danger. The townspeople had begun to look over their shoulders, their lives shattered by the horror of the murders and the chilling letters that followed. Everyone was on edge, and no one felt safe. He knew the next victim was already chosen, and with each passing moment, he was running out of time to stop the killer. The first step was clear. Find the next target. Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities, examining every pattern, every clue. The alphabetical sequence was not just a sick game, it was a map. Every murder was a step closer to the town's core, to something much bigger and more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The killer wasn't simply targeting random victims, they were targeting the town's heart, the very thing that had kept the town alive for generations. Poirot's eyes landed on the town's central square, the oldest part of the town, where the church stood tall, casting a long shadow over the town's secrets. There was no doubt in his mind the killer's final act would take place here, in this sacred, unsuspecting space. The killer was going to strike at the very soul of the town. But who would be the next victim? Poirot's mind spun, but before he could make a move, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. "You think you can stop me, Poirot? You've been chasing shadows, but I am already there, waiting. The last letter will soon be delivered, and you'll be too late." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The killer was closer than ever, and this time, Poirot wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. But he couldn't stop now. Not when everything had led to this moment. Poirot's instincts kicked into overdrive. He gathered his team, and they raced through the narrow streets, past the rows of ancient houses, their windows shuttered tight as if hiding from the growing darkness. Poirot's mind was sharp, but the killer was sharper, already a step ahead. Every corner turn seemed to reveal more danger, more uncertainty. It was clear now. Poirot wasn't chasing the killer, was being hunted. The townspeople had grown increasingly restless, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some feared the murderer had already infiltrated their midst, while others thought it was someone from outside, someone who had been watching them for years. But Poirot had a different theory, a theory that sent a chill down his spine. As he passed the local pub, Poirot caught sight of a figure in the distance, a silhouette standing in the shadows. His heart raced as he recognized the familiar outline. Samar, the town historian. Was he the one behind all of this? Had he been hiding in plain sight all along? Poirot's instincts screamed at him to confront Samar. But before he could act, the man vanished into the night, his figure dissolving into the thick fog that had rolled in from the sea. Poirot paused, his mind spinning. Had it all been a ploy to draw him away? Was Samar truly involved, or had he been manipulated into playing a part in the killer's twisted game? Then came the call that turned everything on its head. "Poirot," the voice whispered urgently. "The church, the bell tower. It's where it all ends. You must come quickly before it's too late." Without another word, Poirot surged into action, his legs carrying him faster than ever before. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he raced toward the church, his heart pounding in his chest. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand. The church stood ominously against the misty sky, its bell tower looming like a dark sentinel. The townspeople had gathered outside, their eyes wide with fear, their murmurs filling the air. Something terrible was about to unfold, and Poirot was determined to be the one to stop it. But as he approached the church, a sense of dread washed over him. It felt too easy. The killer was playing him, luring him into a trap. Poirot reached the church door and paused. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant chime of the clock, marking the final seconds. Poirot stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. The air was heavy with tension. He knew the killer was somewhere inside, watching him, waiting for the moment when he would make his move. But where? As he ascended the staircase toward the bell tower, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. The faintest rustling sound reached his ear, something moving in the shadows. Poirot's hand instinctively went to his pocket, grasping for his revolver. But before he could react, a voice, cold and distant, spoke from behind him. "You should have stayed out of it, Poirot. Now, you are too late." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot spun around, his heart racing. But there was no one there, only the darkness closing in. A single chilling thought gripped him. Was the killer already gone? Had he fallen into the trap he'd been so carefully set up for? The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, and as Poirot turned back toward the stairs, he heard a single, final echo, a bell tolling from above. The last letter had been delivered, and Poirot was running out of time. The emotional climax. The trap closes. The room was suffocating in its silence, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Poirot stood at the center of the dimly lit church, the weight of his every decision pressing down on him like an unbearable force. His eyes flickered around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that would betray the killer's position. But the silence remained unbroken, save for the faint, distant chime of the church bell, its toll marking time that seemed to stand still. Poirot's mind was sharp, clearer than ever, but his heart was heavy. The stakes had never been so high. He had solved countless cases before, but this one was different. The murders, the twisted game with the alphabet, it all led to this moment. The killer was in the room, and yet, somehow, he still couldn't see them. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the cold stone floor. "I know you are here," he called out, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. "I know you've been watching me, studying me, trying to predict my every move. But you've underestimated one thing: the human mind is more unpredictable than you can ever fathom." For a brief moment, there was no answer, only the unsettling hum of tension building in the air. Then, a shadow shifted in the corner of the room. Poirot's eyes snapped to it, but it was gone before he could pinpoint it. "I've been inside your head," Poirot continued, his voice low but steady. "I understand the dark places you've been, the need for revenge, the obsession with control. But it's not too late for you to end this. I know what drives you." A sharp laugh broke the silence, echoing through the church. It was cold, devoid of warmth, and it sent a shiver down Poirot's spine. From the shadows, a figure emerged, their face obscured by a dark hood. The killer had been waiting for Poirot to come to them. "Do you, Poirot?" The voice was muffled, but the bitterness in it was unmistakable. "Do you really understand? You think you know everything about me, about my past. You know nothing." The figure stepped forward, the hood falling away, and Poirot's heart skipped a beat. Samar, the town's historian, the very man who had been by his side through most of the investigation. The one person Poirot had trusted. Samar's face was contorted with rage. But there was something else, something deeper. A vulnerability that Poirot had not seen before, a raw pain that seemed to seep through his cold exterior. "It's always been you, Poirot, hasn't it?" Samar spat, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. "You always thought you could solve it all, but you've never understood the burden of history, of what was done to me, to my family. They took everything from me, everything." Poirot's gaze softened as he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Samar, you are not a murderer. This obsession, this vengeance site will only consume you. The pain you feel, the loss, I understand it. But killing, it will never bring them back. It will never heal you." Samar's eyes darkened, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. "You think I don't know that. You think I don't know the cost. But I had to make them pay. The town, the people who destroyed everything I loved, they will never forget what I've done, and neither will you." Poirot's mind raced as he processed the unfolding truth. Samar's motives weren't just about the murders, they were about reclaiming something lost, something buried in the town's past. The killings were part of a twisted ritual, an attempt to erase the ghosts of history, to rewrite a narrative that had tormented him for years. And now, Poirot stood in the way of that vision. "Samar," Poirot said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, "you are not alone in your suffering. But you cannot erase the past by making others suffer. You must stop this, or it will destroy you." For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of their words, the truth hanging between them like an unspoken promise. But then, with a sudden, violent motion, Samar lunged forward, his hands grasping for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged as he snarled, "You think you can stop me now? It's too late, Poirot. The last letter has already been delivered." Poirot reacted in an instant, his trained mind and steady hand guiding him through the danger. He sidestepped just in time, feeling the sharp edge of the knife pass mere inches from his skin. With swift precision, Poirot grabbed Samar's wrist, twisting it until the weapon fell from his grasp, clattering to the floor with a deafening noise. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the heavy breathing of the two men. Poirot's chest rose and fell with the effort, his eyes locked on Samar's, filled with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "You were never going to win, Samar." Twist ending. The shadows unveil. The air inside the dimly lit study was thick with the stench of tension, every corner heavy with the secrets it held. Poirot, his mind buzzing with the fragments of clues that had come together in a maddening mosaic, stood frozen, staring at the door. The voice that had taunted him through the investigation now echoed in his mind, the cryptic words replaying like a haunting refrain. The final piece is yet to fall into place. His pulse quickened as he pieced it together. The missing puzzle, the key to everything, was hidden in plain sight, and the last letter, now the final victim, would complete the twisted game. But as Poirot stepped forward, ready to confront the murderer, his instincts screamed at him to stop. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. His thoughts raced. Who could it be? Everyone had been accounted for, and yet someone had been working from the shadows, pulling the strings, manipulating them all. And then, in the stillness, it came. The sudden creak of a chair, the unmistakable sound of someone rising from the corner of the room where they'd remained unnoticed. Poirot spun, his hand instinctively reaching for the hidden revolver tucked inside his coat, but before he could make a move, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Lisa Asher. His breath caught in his throat. Lisa, the grieving daughter. The woman who had seemed so innocent, so fragile. She had been at the heart of it all, connected to the first victim, Alice. She had seemed lost, caught up in the chaos of the murders. But now, as the truth hit Poirot like a thunderclap, he realized that Lisa had been playing him from the very beginning. "I suppose you are surprised, Monsieur Poirot," Lisa said, her voice eerily calm, void of the despair he had once seen in her eyes. "You must be, after all this time, after everything you've uncovered." Poirot's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The woman who had appeared so devastated, so overwhelmed by the deaths of those around her, was now standing before him, cold, calculating, and unrecognizable. You were the one," Poirot whispered, his voice barely audible, but full of disbelief. "But why? Why all of this?" Lisa's lips curled into a smile, one that was as chilling as it was cold. "You are not the only one who can solve puzzles, Monsieur Poirot. It's quite simple, really. Revenge. A long, long time coming." Poirot's eyes widened in realization. Revenge. But for what? For whom? She stepped closer, the shadows seeming to embrace her as she moved, a ghost in the room. "You see, Poirot, this was never about the town's forgotten history or the alphabet murders. It was always about my mother. She was the one who suffered. She was the one betrayed by those you trust. Your precious dark secrets, your criminals, they were nothing compared to the real crime." Poirot's chest tightened, his mind struggling to catch up. He had expected many things, but this, the woman he had thought was a victim, a tragic figure, this was something he could never have foreseen. You are her daughter," Poirot stammered. The implications hit him like a punch to the gut. The town's history, the betrayal, the dark secrets, everything connected back to a scandal that Poirot had never fully understood. And now, standing before him was the woman who had been betrayed, and whose mother had been a victim of a crime long buried. Lisa's gaze hardened. "Yes, I am her daughter. But you don't know the whole story, Poirot. My mother, was the one who paid for the sins of others. She was abandoned, her reputation destroyed, and her name erased from history. The people who did this, they thought they could forget. They thought they could get away with it. But I've made sure that everyone remembers. Everyone." Poirot's stomach churned. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the weight of the truth was crushing. All these murders, the letters, the carefully orchestrated killings, they were never about the town or its dark history. It was always about Lisa's mother, her shame, her betrayal. And the deaths? They were Lisa's revenge, one murder for each letter of the alphabet, each victim representing someone who had played a part in her mother's downfall. "You've killed them all," Poirot said, the horror of it sinking in. "You've killed them for her, for your mother." Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes dark with the unspoken pain of a lifetime. "And now, you are the last. You've gotten too close to the truth. But don't worry, Monsieur Poirot. I am not going to kill you." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. His mind scrambled to comprehend her words. Was she playing him? Was this another game? But then, with a cruel smile, Lisa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the final letter, the last piece of the puzzle. "The game is almost over, Poirot," Lisa said softly, holding the letter out to him. "But you should know something. This is the letter you'll—" The climax, the final showdown. The rain lashed against the windows of the crumbling church, its ancient walls holding the weight of forgotten secrets. The scent of mildew and dust filled the air, mingling with the raw tension that hung like a thick fog. Poirot stood at the altar, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet seemed to echo in the silence, a foreboding reminder of the final confrontation that was about to unfold. Across from him, Lisa Asher stood, her face pale but resolute, a cold smirk playing on her lips. The manipulator, the puppeteer, the one who had been weaving a web of death for months. She had been playing a deadly game with Poirot's hand. Now the game was coming to its tragic conclusion. "You've played your part well, Monsieur Poirot," Lisa's voice echoed softly, the mockery clear in her words. "But now the game is finished." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He was calm, as always, but something in his gaze betrayed the weight of the final moments. "You have been careful, Miss Asher, but even the cleverest of plans can fall apart." Lisa's lips trembled for the briefest moment, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her eyes before the mask returned. She moved toward the old rotting pews, her fingers brushing against the worn wood, as if seeking some comfort in the past. Her gaze never left Poirot. "I did what I had to do," she murmured, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't understand, Poirot. It was never about revenge. Not really. It was about control. Control over the ones who wronged my mother. Control over my own fate. They thought they could bury her, erase her from history. But I would make sure everyone knew her name, everyone paid the price for what they did." Poirot's brow furrowed as he stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Control, you say, but at what cost? You have become the thing you despised, a murderer, a killer." Lisa's eyes darkened, her composure finally shattered, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands gripping her hair in frustration. "I never wanted this, Poirot. I never wanted to kill. But they made me. They pushed me until there was nothing left. And now they'll never forget." Poirot stood silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. But in his mind, the pieces were falling into place. Control, revenge. A long, slow burn of grief and rage that had led to this moment. This wasn't just a spree of killings, it was the final act of someone who had been broken long ago. He stepped closer, his voice soft now, almost sympathetic. "But what you don't see, Miss Asher, is that you were never in control. You have been a pawn in someone else's game all along." Lisa's head jerked up, her wide eyes searching his face for an explanation. "A pawn? What are you talking about?" Poirot's lips curled into a slight frown, his gaze sharp as ever. "You were led down this path, just as they wanted. Your mother's betrayal, it was only the beginning. You were manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to push your buttons." Before Lisa could respond, Poirot reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a final letter, a letter that had been hidden, tucked away for far too long. He held it up for her to see, and her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the familiar initials printed in bold ink. L.A. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the letter, but Poirot pulled it back just out of her grasp. "You see, Miss Asher, this is not the end. The game isn't over. Here is more to this mystery than just you and your mother's vengeance." Lisa's face drained of color. She staggered back as if the weight of the revelation had physically struck her. What is this? What are you talking about? Poirot held her gaze, his eyes piercing and calculating. The initials in the letter, they belong to someone who has been orchestrating everything from the shadows, someone who knew exactly what you would do, who pushed you to become their instrument of chaos. Lisa's face twisted with confusion and fear. No, I didn't. But Poirot was already moving. His eyes never left her, and with a final heartbreaking sigh, he spoke. You were never the mastermind, Miss Asher. You were simply part of a much larger, much darker plan. Someone else has been pulling the strings. Someone who will stop at nothing to see their game completed. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder as if approaching from somewhere deep in the darkness. Poirot tensed, his mind racing. The game was not over. The killer was merely a piece in a larger puzzle, and now the truth was about to be revealed. Final twist. The truth is unveiled. As Poirot turned to face the doorway, a shadow stepped into the light, a tall figure, face obscured by a hood, the air thick with the promise of something far worse than what had already transpired. The room seemed to close in around him, and for the first time in the entire investigation, Poirot felt the grip of uncertainty. The figure spoke in a cold, emotionless tone. Poirot, you've come so close, but not close enough. Poirot froze, his heart pounding. His mind raced, and for the first time he was unsure of his next move. The figure stepped forward, the weight of their presence suffocating, and as the hooded figure pulled back their cloak, Poirot's worst fear came true. The murderer had always been a part of the plan. The killer was only a puppet, a pawn, the true mastermind, someone Poirot had never even considered. And just like that, Poirot understood. The game had never been about Lisa, her mother, or even the alphabet murders. It was always about something far more twisted, far more dangerous. The final letter, the one he'd found, was the clue, the final step toward unlocking a chain of events that would change everything. The shadows had been watching, and now the game would end only when the mastermind said it would. Resolution. The endless game. As the hooded figure stepped into the light, Poirot's mind raced, but he knew that this case, this complex, mind-bending web of deception, was far from over. In that moment, he realized that the thin line between sanity and madness had been crossed long ago, and no one, least of all Poirot himself, would ever truly know who was in control. The final puzzle had yet to be solved, and as the figure in the shadows whispered the next clue, Poirot was left standing, caught in the tangled web of mystery. But the truth, the true truth, was still to be revealed. Who do you think is the mastermind behind the A.B.C. murders? Which part of the story shocked you the most?